Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf, and today our special guest is New York Times bestseller author Robert Kurson. Robert, great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I saw you at the Glenview Library program, and it's so nice of you to be in the neighborhood.
Oh, it's a pleasure for me. Thank you.
But it's nice to see you in the community when you must be often traveling, doing promotional tours on Rocketman.
Yes, I had a lot of traveling to do with the book. The book tells the story of Apollo 8, which was the first manned journey to the moon, the first time human beings ever left Earth. But it was published in connection with the 50th anniversary of that mission. So I had a lot of fun opportunity to travel around the country and promote the book, and also to promote the flight, which was really a milestone in human achievement.
Yes, it must be amazing to be part of that energy that people recall such glorious time for the United States.
It was really a glorious time, and really not just for the United States, but for the world. Apollo 8 was epic. It was Homeric in its scope. It represented the first time human beings ever left home, and the first time that we ever arrived at a new world, our most ancient companion, the moon. So this was something that, even if we survive as a species for billions of years, will never happen again. We will only have left home for the first time once, and it was with Apollo 8. So it was a really big celebration for the 50th anniversary.
That's wonderful. And I remember that in your book, you talked about a lot of the difficulties. That was just astounding, incredible that it could actually make its tour.
Yes, it was 4 months before the flight went. It wasn't even on paper. It wasn't even conceived yet. But the United States was in a very big battle with the Soviet Union, the space race, as part of the bigger Cold War at the time. And a pinnacle element of that space race was which side would send the first humans to the moon. And it looked in mid-1968, even in the summer of 1968, like the Soviets would defeat the United States, would get the first humans to the moon. And then through a series of incredibly brave, bold decisions at NASA, a plan was devised to send Apollo 8, which was originally scheduled just for a routine low Earth orbital mission, to skip that mission and send it all the way 240,000 miles away to the moon. It required immense courage on the part of NASA and the astronauts, boldness, daring, like...
What a wager, right?
It really was. And people across the world begged NASA not to do this, including the editorial pages of the most prominent newspapers, and even the leading astronomer in the world, Sir Bernard Lovell, no relation to Jim Lovell, who was on the flight of Apollo 8, begged the United States to stand down. It just looked so risky and so impossible to defeat the Soviets at such a late date in late 1968. But NASA believed in itself and planned this mission not just for the end of 1968, but for Christmas, planning for the spacecraft to be in orbit on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of 1968, which also happened to be perhaps the worst year in the United States history. So all these events came together. 1968 was a terrible time for the United States. It was the deadliest year for the war in Vietnam. We were on our way to 16,000 dead in Vietnam. You had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy in that year.
Oh my, yes.
There was violence in the streets nearly every week, including in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. And here at the very end of that terrible and bloody, divisive year, where everybody in the country seemed torn against everyone else, we're planning to send these 3 men to the moon on a rocket that had only been tested twice, the mighty Saturn V rocket, and which had failed in only its second test. So it was incredibly risky, with terrible results that could have come on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of this very, very divisive and terrible year.
Right. Wow, what a dramatic setting for a launch. And that is a wonderful thing to have with a book, to start off with the intensity of what that time looked like.
It was amazingly intense, and I really didn't know much about Apollo 8 until I, almost by accident, came across the spacecraft at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, because that's its home. And I started to read about it, and as I read about it, I thought, if I'm not mistaken, this is the single most dramatic and exciting and daring and risky space mission of all time. And yet Apollo 11, which made the first landing, is much better known. than Apollo 8, but I thought Apollo 8 was an even better story. But when I started to research it, I realized that I wasn't the only one who thought so. Astronaut after astronaut from that era, when they were interviewed, also called Apollo 8 perhaps the greatest mission of all of them. And so I felt like my instinct was correct about it, that this really was the greatest of all the space flights.
So this was for them, it was maybe the Apollo 11 were the ones who felt they were following the leadership of Apollo 8.
That's absolutely right. You know, the crew of Apollo 11, which made the first landing, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Mike Collins, they were the backup crew for Apollo 8. So they trained with the astronauts of Apollo 8 all the way through the mission. And when you read interviews with them, like I remember seeing an interview with Neil Armstrong in which he spoke reverentially about Apollo 8. And what he said, in effect, was, by the time we went to the moon on Apollo 11, everything you needed to know to do to go to the moon was known and proved doable already, except for the landing itself. But when Apollo 8 went, nobody knew that any of it could be done. So the risks that the astronauts on Apollo 8 took were almost inconceivable.
Yes, and they were the scouts for the future.
Absolutely, they were the
success.
first. They were the first. So nobody knew if that rocket would work. Again, as I said, the Saturn V, which was the only rocket capable of delivering humans to the moon, and which remains, by the way, Yvonne, believe it or not, this many years later, 51 years later, the most powerful machine ever built. To this day, the Saturn V had only flown twice before Apollo 8, both times in unmanned tests, the second of which had failed spectacularly. So to climb on this 363-foot tall rocket and to go to the moon after it had only been tested twice was just immensely risky in and of itself. So that was just the start of the risk. There were many, many more. And the whole flight, in addition to all the risk, was done with only 4 months of planning and preparation.
That's inconceivable.
It is inconceivable because at NASA, space flights usually took between 12 and 18 months of planning, training, execution. Here they were going to do it 4 months, really all in a rush to beat the Soviets to the moon at Christmas of 1968.
Right. And we would never think of such a short deadline now. So the research you did, how long it took? I mean, it must have been a mountain of research and interviews. Did you conduct personal interviews? I believe you had some.
Absolutely. One of my biggest lucky breaks in this book was that the 3 astronauts from Apollo 8 were still living. And not just living, but so sharp and interesting and funny and with such photographic recall.
Wonderful.
And they all agreed to work with me, which was the best break I think I've ever had.
Yes, that's
as a
a
writer.
writer's dream, right?
A writer's dream. And they were so kind and warm and generous with their time and welcoming to me that it really made the book much, much easier to do, and it made it much, much better of a documentary of this incredible event.
And I believe you were invited to the home of one of the interviewees.
Well, all 3,
all
yeah.
3, okay,
The crew for Apollo 8 was Frank Borman. He was the commander of Apollo 8. Jim Lovell and Bill Anders. Well, Jim Lovell we know from Apollo 13, where there was a dramatic movie made where Tom Hanks played Jim Lovell. But Jim Lovell also was on Apollo 8. And he happens to live only about 15 or 20 minutes from my home. So that was another lucky break for me. So once I contacted him and he invited me to come over, then he put me in touch with the other astronauts and I was off to the races. So I could go spend time with them at their homes and really get to know them and to really learn this story on a very personal level in addition to a technical level.
This is wonderful to hear about the behind the scenes of the book in such an incredible time of American history. We are in Glenview and you live just a stone's throw away. Can you tell us why, what this community means to you?
Yeah, well, I love living here. I moved to Northbrook just a few days before high school started.
And you went to Glenbrook North.
I went to Glenbrook North, yeah, and I graduated from Glenbrook North. And I didn't have the easiest time in high school. There were certain problems going on in my family, some difficulties. And so it was a rough time growing up there. Yeah. I didn't do very well in high school. So I think
that's a good inspiration for many of our students who feel very pressured now, even more so.
Absolutely. It's not, high school is just one small element of life.
That's
Yeah, and I didn't do well, and I kind of presumed, well, since I was a poor student who had some difficulty going on at home, I was probably destined for a bad future, but that's not the case at all. And so I did have a very poor class rank at Glenbrook North. I think I graduated, when I applied to college, my rank was 606 out of 660.
Oh my.
So there was only 54 people worse than me.
Oh my gosh.
But when I got to college, I hit my stride.
Yeah.
And so
sometimes you just need a change of environment.
Yes,
Something.
absolutely. So high school, Glenbrook North is a wonderful high school. I have a son there myself right now,
Right.
and another one who's going to be there next year. So I think it's one of the greatest high schools there is, but it wasn't the right time for me to excel there.
For your time there, you did start your writing there, right?
I did, and it was a strange thing because I did so poorly at almost everything I did at Glenbrook North, except I found myself writing for the school newspaper. And I had such a wonderful person there who welcomed me and encouraged me. I had no idea that I had any interest in writing or that it might figure into my life at any point, but I was encouraged by her and given responsibility there, and I started to do well at it. I saw that I had a little knack for telling a story.
Yes.
After I left Glenbrook North, I never thought about writing again for another 13 or 14 years. Never occurred to me.
Wow.
But it stayed in the back of my mind, so I'm grateful to Glenbrook North and to the Glenbrook North Torch and to the lovely woman who ran it there.
Sometimes that beginning experience is what you come back to
Yes.
and build on. Yes, I think that writing is something that once we go into the real world, we see how much intimidates people.
Oh, yeah.
And having a newspaper background, it gives us that format to overcome in those short deadlines, right?
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah, and it teaches you how to express things tightly and on a deadline, and how to think clearly, and it gives you the first taste of what it means to have a voice. And so
That's true.
I think it was the best thing I ever did in high school, maybe in any school. It was really, really encouraging to me.
That's a really good point for all of our viewers who might be struggling with that prospect. High school students are hard to lead and push, and they need to know that it's not the only part of their life they can excel and grow.
Could not agree with that more.
Robert, as a New York Times bestseller, you probably don't need a lot of publicity, but the social media is very new in your career. It changes your career, doesn't it? How have you adapted to this format and people writing to you now about how they enjoy your book?
Yeah,
Having that more immediacy to your readers.
Yes, social media is new, especially to someone like me, because when I published my first book in 2004, I don't think there was Twitter. There was very little presence for authors on social media. And I guess I'm old-fashioned and old enough to have needed to be pushed into it, sort of. And I still don't know if I do it well. I have a Twitter account and a Facebook author page and things like that. And I try to reach out to my audience through email newsletters and things like that. But I had to have it explained to me and urged on me, because I used to be of the mindset that I'll make my books and the quality of the books will reach people naturally.
Speak
for themselves, yeah. And then some people very gently and kindly corrected me and said, that's not the way the world works anymore. Yeah. And you should really get involved with social media. So I think it's essential now for anyone who has any kind of public connection to reach their audience that way. So I try harder and harder every day. I'm probably not the best at it, but I'm trying to get better.
So you are handling yourself, whereas your publisher assigning someone to help you with some of the regular mailings or the
it's all
content?
on me.
It is?
It's all on me, yeah. They leave it to the authors, and so I put up a web page that I designed. I was very careful about the design of my website and how things look and how you can contact me through the website. So, but that was all my responsibility, as my Twitter account is and my Facebook page and everything like that. So the publisher is very happy to give you suggestions if you ask, but really it's your responsibility as a writer to do that yourself.
What do you enjoy about hearing from your readers?
I love to hear from my readers. From the first book I published 15 years ago, I put my email address right on the book, on the jacket of the book, and people are free to reach out to me so I can hear what moves people, what was important to them, and even criticisms. I didn't like this part, or I wish you had done this better. I'm open to hearing all of it. Also, sometimes readers contact me with book ideas, which is really interesting because finding a good book idea is the single hardest part of my job. So I love the feeling of connectedness with people and getting to hear people's stories. You know, after I published Rocket Men, I heard from lots of people who had family and friends who worked for NASA who had other stories, additional stories to tell. And so I can learn even more about the book I published from readers. So it's all good for me.
Is it likely that you'll add an addendum or a newer edition with that information?
I think in this one, when the paperback came out recently, I added a few anecdotes that were brought to me by readers who had worked for NASA. And so it didn't change the book much. You know, it had a few extra words here and there, but there were really interesting things that I felt were worthy of inclusion. So I'm always loving to hear from people and hear their perspective on my work.
On your website, do you have a calendar of where they can see you next time, or?
Yes, I do normally. The publicity for this one has wound down, so that it's not very full right now. But yes, when I'm typically on book tour, you can see all the places I'll be, and it's very fun to reach readers in person that way too, because people will show up and tell you stories that way as well.
Yes. And how long would you recommend other writers to plan your book tour? Like how long after the book has been launched?
Well, often it's good to start right when the book is launched, because that's when media outlets like to promote books, is when they're new and newly available.
Yes.
And certainly when, in the case of Rocket Men, when there was an anniversary coming up, it was essential to...
Deadline to meet, yeah.
It was a deadline to meet. But I think it's never too late to promote your books and to get out there and talk about them. So I'm all for doing book tours for as long as you can find an audience.
From our shows, we found out that the digital or the ebook availability and the fact that people are publishing from more smaller publishers, that books actually have a longer time to promote itself. Do you agree, or do you think that's...
I do. You know, typically a book in a physical bookstore will be on the shelves for a matter of weeks or maybe a couple months after its publication, and then it's replaced often by newer books. But with ebooks, they're constantly available at all times. But we have to also remember the phenomenon of audiobooks, which is a much bigger deal than it was even when I started writing books 15 years ago. When I published my first book, Shadow Divers, 15 years ago, I put out an abridged version of the book, which was painful for me because I lost 35 or 40% of the book in the abridged version.
Oh, yeah.
Now they don't do abridged versions very much. And people listen to their audiobooks in the car while driving.
Yes.
And so that's become a much bigger part of book publishing also. And that is always available as well as a download. So the book world has changed even in these last 15 years since I've been involved. And people are finding and digesting their books in all kinds of ways.
How are you doing the audiobooks? So is it your decision, or is your publisher who has somebody professional to read your book, or do you read it yourself?
I read a small part of my book. For Rocket Men, I read the prologue and a note on sources. But a professional reader named Ray Porter, who's, in my opinion, the best there is in the business, read the bulk of the book, most of the book, as he did my previous book as well. And so when a publisher puts out a major title, often they'll have a professional reader who has a great voice and is a trained actor and reader, and you can hear the difference.
I would think that's a better way to go as well, just because they can have a better dramatic presentation sometimes. And but do you get any kind of say-so on keeping the same reader, or does it change every book? You know, do you get to say, I like this one,
yes,
I would like to keep him?
Yeah, I did get to say that because Ray Porter read my previous book called Pirate Hunters in 2015. And I was so thrilled with his interpretation of it that I asked Random House if I could keep him, and they were certainly happy to keep him. So yeah, you have some say in it, but I think the publisher also has to approve of the reader and feel confident in the reader as well.
Yes, I noticed that with other writers that they tend to have a couple of special people who continues their, especially if it's a trilogy or a series.
Yes,
And I enjoy that very much when listening on their long drives.
I do too.
And I think that that is almost a necessary version of your book to have.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Does it take long to get an audio book produced, or how does the pacing of it as you launch? Is it same time it's launched?
Yes, it comes out at exactly the same time, or at least it has in the case of my 4 books.
Okay.
And the reading of it I've done in the studio in New York at Random House's offices. And it's a very interesting experience to go into the audio studio and you have a director and you have to read very cleanly. And if you make a mistake, you have to start again. And it's interesting.
Yeah, more vigorous than our program.
It's very vigorous. You can't make any mistakes. And if you make a mistake, they start you over. And you realize that reading something out loud is different than it sounds in your head, even when you are the writer. And when I write my books, I often read them aloud to myself at home because it's a different rhythm and it comes out differently. And so it's a strange experience to have headphones on and read your work slowly and clearly and crisply. And
That's true, because that reading is very different from a silent experience.
It's very different. You hear things in your head one way, and you read them aloud in a different way. Even if it's your own work, it comes out differently when spoken aloud. And so that's something that I've taken from the audiobook experience and used in my writing at home, is to read aloud to myself.
Yes, yes. And do you record it and hear it back, or listen to a playback, or do you just read it straight?
I just read straight, and then the director in the studio will say, "That sounds good, we can use that."
Oh, I mean when you're at home.
Oh, when I'm at
When
home.
you're home.
Yes.
Because as a writing experience, because our audience always try to learn something about how to be a better writer.
Yes, I don't play it back. I'm not
Just
a huge
hearing.
fan of my own voice, it turns out.
Oh, I don't think
But
any of us
yes,
are.
I can tell when I read aloud if things don't sound right lyrically, or if they sound clunky in a way that my brain, if it's reading silently, will skip over. And so I'm looking for things that slow me down when I read aloud. And if something slows me down, I have a good idea that maybe not written that well. And so I'll go back and take a look at that section.
Well, I notice myself when a sentence gets too long, you don't realize until you're reading it aloud. That is, right? You don't see it on the page the same way as
That's
you
right.
hear
And you may
it.
run out of breath reading a sentence that's too loud, and there's no need for breathing when you're silent. So I found that to be a really, really helpful exercise for me at home.
I think that's a wonderful tip to our writers, because we enjoy writing and we don't think about the vocal qualities of it.
Yes. And it's interesting also, Yvonne, to have other people read aloud your work as you're working on it, because no one will read in the same rhythms and meters and emphasis that you hear it in your own head. You have to hear how other people read. And if something doesn't sound right when another person reads it, your first instinct might be to say, you're not reading it right. But everybody reads right according to their own style. So you have to allow for that and listen. If something doesn't sound right when another person reads aloud, maybe you look at that as well.
Now, Robert, that photo of the Earthrise, the iconic photo that's known worldwide, it comes from Apollo 8 mission, right?
It does. It was taken by Bill Anders on the fourth revolution of the 10 orbits they made around the moon. And it shows the Earth rising over the lunar horizon. And it became arguably, in my opinion, the most famous and powerful and important photograph of all time. It is us looking back on ourselves as a whole. And it deeply moved the astronauts and really changed them and changed their lives to see it. We all know that photo was taken by Apollo 8. And one of the interesting things was they were never prepared to see that. They had trained so thoroughly on photographing the moon and observing the moon and studying what they were seeing that they never prepared to see Earth back home. And yet here was this beautiful, colorful blue and white marble, a jewel, rising over the lunar surface, the gray lunar surface, against a black infinity of space. And I was very careful to talk to the astronauts and have them describe exactly what that meant to them to see it. And you could even hear them reacting to it when you listen to tapes of the mission, which you can listen to on YouTube anytime, and they are overwhelmed with the beauty and the majesty and the emotion of it. And it became really, in my opinion, the most famous photograph of all time.
And people should really read that section you wrote about how it just made the heartbeat to scramble for that photo being taken.
It did. They were changed forever by it. And I think anyone who sees the photograph understands why that happened to them and feels a little bit changed themselves.
Yes. I believe that the astronauts currently on the Interstellar Space Station have talked about how it makes them feel to see an Earthrise.
Yes, it's an immensely moving experience. You realize how fragile the Earth is and how alone we are in the universe and how beautiful this planet is. Jim Lovell often describes heaven as being Earth. And when you see it from a lunar distance and you can see the entire planet as one, you realize just how alone we are and how much we need each other and how fragile but beautiful our existence is. And it's all wrapped up in that single photograph that seems to live forever now.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Robert, for being on our program.
It's a pleasure for me. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.